final buck on the 53 ElDorado. Came out beautiful. Really happy with it. We're all real happy with how this car turned out. But this car has been here since about July, I think it showed up. But it started off as the metal work was supposed to be done, and it was kind of more or less pure for filler work and paint. And that snowballed very quickly once we started trying to do gaps and things like that. Nothing really fit. We had to actually lengthen the door about 3/8 of an inch and take about 3/8 of an inch out of the hood to get clearance for when we opened the door. This door was behind the hood and it was hitting the hood. So we had to do a lot of modification there. This section of the car was very tricky, both for the trunk and for the boot lid, as they call it. The way this convertible top lid opens, it opens this way. So getting this, the depth of this was completely wrong if you wanted a nice 3/16 gap. Originally, these had probably a 1/4 inch gap. So once we went 3/16 and started trying to panel to panel, we had a lot of issues. We had a lot of modifying to do there and with the trunk. The trunk was really low compared to the body, and this was all filled with lead. We had to take a bunch of the lead out and kind of form the body, because a lot of these cars were made with a lot of lead in them. And this car had been at another shop where they put more lead in it, and there was a lot of lead in this car. So with this boot, the way this opens this way, but then these flippers, when you move the top up or down, I believe with the top up, these flippers actually flip underneath here and then it lays back down. So that was another thing to be very cautious of, is to make sure that all this fits and folds and nothing hits when it's down by the wheel well in the car. Another thing that complicated this whole boot lid situation is these interior pieces. You see most of them. A lot of the interior pieces are painted in these cars. And to get the gap from that rear interior panel to be right up against that boot lid flipper and fade away into a bigger gap to where the back seat would be, that was a real tricky area. We had a lot of modifying and welding and cutting and grinding on the interior pieces to get them all to fit together with the boot lid, with the rubber, in the gutter. There was a lot of complications back there. These cars, the rear quarters actually bolt on, so they use a weather strip bead, I'll say. It's similar to what they use on a Model A and things like that to kind of hide that gap. So while we did body work on this, obviously we can't have this in there, or even an old one in there, because it'd be in the way of doing panel to panel and trying to make everything perfect. What we did is actually just put a piece of cardboard in there to simulate this rubber strip bead being in there and spacing the quarter out. Otherwise that can affect things like the panel to panel from the door to the quarter. Another battle that we had on this car was the hood, the way the hood fit. It really didn't fit. It fit the fenders okay, it didn't fit the doors, it didn't fit the cowl was way too low. We had a lot of modifying on that gap and panel to panel back there. But the hood springs on these are very odd. A lot of times with a traditional style spring hinge on a hood, the spring goes from something on the hinge to something on the hinge. So you can actually unbolt the spring or unbolt the hinge and leave the spring on there. These are a lot different. And adjusting these, you really can't put the hood spring on until you have the hood adjusted where you want it, which the hood spring changes a little bit. So it's a constant battle to get this hood to fit. But this hood spring actually goes from the hinge, it hooks on the hinge and it goes straight down to a pocket of the body. And anytime with the spring on, anytime that you would loosen these hood hinges up to try to adjust the hood up or down, it would just pull it right down. So when we assembled this car, we got the back half together, we got the doors on, then we set the hood without the radiator support or the springs in, and then we put the fenders on, line the hood and the fenders up, and then we had to put the springs on after that, which was dangerous, to say the least. Another challenging thing on this car was in this area, the windshield frame to the cowl. These actually bolt on from the bottom, but the factory brazed them on. And this is solid brass. So this came off the car, was sent out to get re-chromed, came back to us, was back on the car, the windshield had to be fit again, back on the car, and we tried to braze it like the factory did, and this brass is so thick we couldn't get it to pool. So what we did is use some 3M structural adhesive down in there, put all the bolts in, really cleaned that up good, blasted it a little bit down in the cracks, and I feel like that's going to be stronger than any braze anyway. So the whole process that this car went through was down to metal. Most of the car we stripped, which wasn't necessarily the original plan, but once we got the car and started playing with it, we decided we're going to strip pretty much everything. The car had metal work done, and it wasn't epoxy, but a lot of it I didn't like. A lot of it had to be redone. So we did all the metal work, did our gaps, things like that. We put BP 2050 on it, and we let that sit for a week or so. De-ate it down with 80 like we usually do, started doing filler work, and that's when we ran into some problems here and there with, once we got things panel to panel, a lot of the gaps we're wanting to hit, like the boot lid back there. Some of the rubbers were kind of pushing things out once we put the rubbers in. So there was constant battles with this car. So as far as cut and buff on this car, we did 600 wet. The linear paper on the linear blocks is how we initially started to cut this car. We generally use the longer linear blocks for cutting clear up to about 2,000, 1,500 to 2,000. And at that point, a lot of times we go to the blocks like Jason Kilmer likes to use. They're acrylic on one side, different softnesses of foam, variety of different rigidities of foam on the other side. But that works really well for areas like this hood where it's real dished, real concave. Most of this car is very curvy, so a lot of those blocks from Kilmer came in handy in a lot of places. But the main thing is that we're cutting it flat to begin with a hard block.